The exact same thing happening in today's economy has happened many times before in history. A prime example seen thousands of years ago ended in the collapse of one of the greatest empires in human history, the Roman Empire. Before we start, here's a short summary of our current economic situation and how this video can help you.
With coronavirus causing a global shutdown, central banks are printing currency faster than ever before, and debt to GDP ratios are rising to unsustainable levels all over the world. Things look grim, but surely they can't get any worse. Actually, they could. But maybe by increasing your understanding of money and monetary history, you can be prepared. This video is split into two parts: understanding what money is using historical examples, and then comparing past economies to our present ones. By the end, you'll understand exactly what Mark Twain meant when he said, "History doesn't repeat, but it often rhymes."
So, to start off the first part of this video, what is money? We must go back to 3200 BC. Here, writing was only just invented in the Egyptian and Sumerian civilizations. On the other hand, money was only invented around 600 BC. So then, how did these people pay taxes to their kings or pharaohs before the invention of money? Well, these civilizations were primarily agricultural, so people used to pay taxes in the form of, say, wheat or barley. As for trading goods or services with each other, bartering was used. Bartering is where some amount of one good was traded for a certain amount of another good, an exchange of goods and services without using money. This proves to us that economies can function without physical money. Why? Well, this is because the real value behind money actually lies in the goods and services that you're able to obtain with it. In this sense, one could argue that wheat is money, rice is money, and so on, as long as you can use it to obtain any goods available in the market at that time. In fact, if we were to look at past societies, we see clear examples of this. Around 9000 to 6000 BC, cattle and plant products were primarily used as money. In 1200 BC, shells were used as money. Then by 1000 BC, metals like knives were traded within countries like China. It was actually not until 500 BC when the very first early coins started to appear. And so the first key point I want you to remember is that money can literally be any item as long as it is socially accepted as payment for goods and services. Now, to start off the second point, I'm going to take you through an example that I want you to picture in your head. Okay, I want you to imagine yourself walking down a street, and all of a sudden, you find a blank piece of paper on the floor. How do you feel? Nothing? Okay. Now imagine you continue walking, and now you see a £20 note on the floor. Do you feel any different to before? Yes, you do, but why? What are you thinking of doing with this £20 note that you couldn't do with the blank piece of paper? Yes, you're thinking of buying something with it. In other words, you have faith that in exchange for that particular piece of paper, you can purchase a good or service with it. But in exchange for, say, the blank piece of paper, you know you cannot. That is to say, that the people of a society will only agree that something, say shells, are a form of money if there is an innate trust in the system that at any time in the future I can exchange my shells for goods and services. As remember, it's these goods like food that have the intrinsic value. There is no actual intrinsic value or utility of the shells, and this means that no one would want to save the shells unless they knew they could buy, say, food or clothes with it. And so the same goes for paper. So in short, the second key point is that it is the faith in a form of money to be a valid form of payment for goods and services now and in the future that gives a form of money its ability to function as money. And that is why nobody treats a blank piece of paper and a £20 note in the same way, despite them both being the same material. But if someone were to all of a sudden lose this faith, say in the dollar or pound, then both pieces of paper will be worthless and can no longer function as or be called money. Now that we have an understanding of what money is, let's move on to part 2 of this video and look at where money went wrong in the past and how this relates to present day economies like the US and UK. Precisely, we'll go to 510 BC, where ancient Rome started off as a republic after overthrowing a monarchy. They were mostly using gold and silver coinage as their currency, and for smaller transactions they had copper and bronze coins. Now, what was the benefit to Rome of using gold and silver? Well, put simply, its supply was limited. This is the opposite to what we have in today's economies, where the supply of currency can be increased by central banks, as we're currently seeing in this coronavirus crisis. If too much money is printed, this can lead to hyperinflation, where the general prices of goods can skyrocket and the true value of, say, a dollar or pound can rapidly decrease. This is exactly what happened after World War I, where people's savings lost around 90% of their value, and so for this reason inflation is also known as an invisible tax. Thus, using gold and silver meant that Rome's money supply was stable, and evidence suggests that no big inflation occurred for almost 200 years in their early economy. This was also the case for modern economies that had similarly started off using gold and silver as money, just like the US, who also had very stable prices from the late 1700s to early 1900s. Now back to Rome. Things looked good, until came the Second Punic War. The government needed a way to pay for this war, and taxes weren't enough. And so, the debasement started. Debasement means lowering the quality of coinage by reducing the content of precious metal. In other words, the amount of actual gold in a Roman gold coin was reduced. To do this, the coins that were collected in taxes were melted and had cheaper, more abundant base metals added to them, so that more coins overall could be produced. This is how the money supply was increased, and so how a long period of practically no inflation came to an end. This ongoing debasement of the money for war spending and public works led to hyperinflation, economic chaos, and eventually their coins' silver and gold content was reduced so much that they were now essentially just worthless base metal. Eventually, now that the coins couldn't be debased anymore, Rome's government had to move to more extreme measures of funding the war, which included massively taking control away from the people, for instance, forcefully taking private property, and in the process of this now dictatorship rather than republic, the whole empire soon collapsed. And so this leaves us with the third key point, that is, currency only maintains its value because of its rarity. Even the Roman jurist Julius Paulus stated that money maintains purchasing power not so much from its substance as from its quantity. Hence, by debasing a currency, you increase its supply, and so you reduce the quality of this money and so the quality of the society. To make sure that the Roman Empire wasn't just a one-off occurrence, let's look at another example from history. In fact, let's fast forward to the year 806, where the first known banknotes came into existence in China. And remember now, it doesn't matter whether the money is leather, paper or rock, it's quantity that gives money value. So what do you think happened in China over the next 600 years? Well, the quantity of paper notes grew in production, slowly at first, but then at a faster and faster pace. Does this sound familiar to you? This led to the value of these banknotes rapidly depreciating, and as a result, inflation soared. And you can guess what happened next. The use of that paper money was completely abandoned in China for hundreds of years, until our current fiat system today. Now that we've looked at the past, how would what we learnt be applied to the present? Well, in a perfect world, we would have our currencies backed one-to-one with gold or silver, due to their limited quantity, and have them stored in central banks. This way, the quantity of money is controlled and society is protected from inflation. This actually was the case in the past for countries like the US and UK. Gold was made the standard of value in England in 1816, and proper guidelines were written to allow for a non-inflationary production of standard banknotes that would represent a certain amount of gold. This was the first time that the worth of banknotes had been directly tied to gold, and this worked well, as subsequently inflation was kept under control. However, as we've seen in the past, soon things went wrong, and countries started to leave the Bretton Woods gold standard one by one, the first one being the United States in 1971. Immediately after, the US faced huge inflation and developed into a very fragile economy. Moving forward to more recent years, debt levels in our economies have grown out of control, and the amount of money being printed is skyrocketing. Coronavirus is only speeding up this process. The same pattern is being seen in many developed countries, again including both the UK and United States, both of whose debt levels as a percentage of their GDP can be seen in these charts. You can see that there is a clear upwards trend, and imagine how much worse debt and money creation figures must get whilst we deal with the impact of coronavirus and the 2020 recession over the next 6 months to 2 years. Is going back to the gold standard the best solution? Well, I personally think that using banknotes backed by gold and silver would be best if kept to strict ratios. This would control inflation and ensure the value of a pound or dollar doesn't depreciate over time, as it is backed by real money. However, I don't think this would ever happen, as we're all too far gone at this point to ever come back. Also, if you were to type in US debt clock on Google, it's got some really interesting information on there. You'll see a lot of different figures, but more specifically, I want you to look at the dollar to silver ratio and dollar to gold ratio. These ratios tell us that if we were to increase the price of silver or gold up to the point where the US government's silver/gold supply covers every single dollar ever printed, then in the case of silver at least, its price would be $2,150, and then if you were to look at gold, similarly gold's worth would be $17,800. Now these prices are obviously much larger than their current paper spot prices, and even more interestingly, if you compare this to the same dollar to silver and dollar to gold ratios in the year 1913, there were only $2.64 for silver and $28.81 for gold. You can clearly see that there's a big difference from 1913 to now, so over the last 100 years, and this just clearly demonstrates how much money has been created out of thin air, and subsequently how much the value of a dollar has depreciated over time. Okay, we now know what happened in the past in economies where money is excessively created, and it is quite possible that the same pattern seen in the past, say in Rome, could happen again in today's developed economies, but only time will tell if it will. As Mark Twain said, history doesn't repeat, but it often rhymes. If there's one thing you remember in this video, let it be this next point. Fiat currency will always depreciate in value over time, such that if you hold savings, it will eventually become worthless if the amount of money creation by central banks keeps increasing, as we are seeing currently in response to coronavirus. So far in human history, no society with currency supply manipulation has ever survived. Gold, on the other hand, maintains its value in terms of what goods and services it can buy, as its supply is fixed. An example to illustrate its strength as real money is that the average modern American family can afford nearly 5 times as much bread as the average Roman household. Similarly, the average American family can also afford 5 times as much gold as the average Roman household. Hence, even over thousands of years, gold's purchasing power has remained stable against basic goods. In other words, an ounce of gold would be able to purchase approximately the same amount of bread in Rome than it could in America today. And I'm sure this is the case for many other developed economies too. I hope this video has made you even just a bit more aware of potential flaws or risks within our monetary system. And if you enjoyed this video, I plan to release a similar one soon that will reveal much more insightful information about our manipulated economic system. So make sure to subscribe and click the notification bell to to get an update when this is released. And until then, stay safe.